Hey everyone, welcome back to Making the Game, from concept to Kickstarter. In this podcast, I, Reese Robbins, the lead game designer for the game Bloodthrone, discuss the process of going from tabletop gaming idea through the development process to crowdfunding, production, fulfillment, and more. For those of you interested, Bloodthrone is still available on GameFound via their pledge manager, so if you want to pick up the game, you can go on over there and do so. In this episode, we will discuss the equipment and loot system in Bloodthrone as requested by David K. over in the Bloodthrone Facebook group. And again, if you would like to join the discussion, the Facebook group is the best place to do so. Just look up Bloodthrone Game. Before we dive in, I wanted to do some housekeeping. We will, for the time being, call this a bi-weekly podcast with occasional bonus episodes. As I have mentioned in the past, I'm extremely experienced in podcasting, having done over 1,000 episodes in the tabletop gaming sphere with our previous business podcasts. Signals from the Frontline was the primary one. But I have so much going on in my personal life right now, I've been finding it difficult to stick to a weekly publication schedule. So for the time being, let's just be honest and call it bi-weekly. I think once we get our wedding behind us, my life will definitely calm down a bit. And that is August 9th. So almost there. Really excited for that and to see all the family. I will be getting the retailer order form out this weekend, no later than Monday. Thanks for the ongoing patience with that. I've got all the pricing and everything finalized. I just needed to work with our ordering department over at our company, Frontline Gaming, to make sure that they were getting all the data that they needed. The Bloodthrone YouTube channel will be operational this coming week. I am just uploading the existing content to it, and I will post the link to it in next Friday's update on GameFound and Kickstarter. The neoprene gaming mat that has the same design as the board in the core box will be on GameFound this weekend. I'm hoping to get it done today, Saturday, but if not, it will be done tomorrow morning, Sunday, for sure, and that's the 30th of June that I'm referencing. We are still working on the Sundrop painting option for the miniatures. I had a meeting with our partner, Cuttlefish Colors, last week, and they feel like they've got something that's ready to go. So hopefully in the next week or two, we'll have that so I can show what it will look like to the backers so they can decide if they want it or not. And then, of course, we'll also offer a fully painted option via our FLG Paint Studio as well. As for the development process, as stated last episode, we are working on the final molds for the Hero expansion. Those should be done by the end of July. We are getting through the updated cards now. Again, we've added art to those. I'll show an example of that probably in the next week, maybe week or two. I want to show those off because I think they look really cool. We're aiming to have everything wrapped up end of July so that we can begin manufacturing in August, most likely. It will be a sprint as the books are taking way longer than I had anticipated. It's basically just graphic design and laying everything out in a way that makes sense. That's proven to be more challenging than we'd initially thought it would be. But now that we have templates for things like the mission layouts and how we're going to present character dialogue and things of that nature, it should start going relatively quickly. But getting to that point took a little bit longer than anticipated. Plus the editing process also took longer than anticipated. So if anything is going to delay us at this point, it will be the books. But as I had stated, I think at worst, it would be weeks to a month. I'm pushing as hard as possible to get this done before my wedding, which would be the end of July. Now to the topic at hand, loot. Loot is a critical part of any RPG experience, and one of the most enjoyable aspects of these kinds of games is the gradual increase in power you feel from leveling up and acquiring new equipment. In a typical RPG-style game, you have tons of options. You can change your armor, weapons, make your character look a different way from the beginning to the end of the game, and that's a really fun part of it, especially in CRPGs. However, one of the limitations in a dungeon diver-style game with pre-made miniatures is the fact that the models can't be changed once they're made. We looked into the possibility of modular models, but the technology isn't quite there yet without requiring significant modeling skills for the end user. And one of our maxims for designing the game was that we wanted it to be easy to dive into. Thus, we are going with pre-assembled models so you can just open up the game and go. With that limitation in mind, we were not able to have options such as changing the weapon of a character without asking the player to make a pretty big leap in imagination. For example, if a model physically had a sword and then you found a magical mace or whatever, and you're like, oh no, that character actually has a mace, we really didn't feel like that was the right option for us. The aesthetics of the game is one of the highest priorities in the design process. So we opted to go with a different system. Now, in the future, we hope to be able to allow players to customize their models more, and we're working on ways to do that, possibly with 3D printing or multi-part model kits. Those are much more difficult to make, and they require modeling skills on the part of the player. A lot of people who come to a board game experience, that's not what they want. So we're mulling away around different options for that as a possibility. But for the time being, where we're at now with budgetary and technological restraints, we decided not to go with that option at this point in time. On that note, though, as we have mentioned in several other episodes of the show, is that with the hero expansion, you will have the ability to make your own custom heroes. And as such, you can design them however you like. The example I've been using is the elf fighter I made that has light armor, a light shield, and a spear. He sacrificed damage reduction. He's still hard to hit, but he didn't reduce the amount of damage he took as much. But he was super fast, and he has a reach weapon, which gives you extra range in melee. So you could fly around the table. Again, in our game, elves are faster than other races, and it's explained in the lore. So he was kind of the opposite of Ajax. Ajax is sort of the quintessential tank. He's slow. He's hard to hurt. He's actually hard to hit as well. I'll explain that in a little bit. And he has a ton of hit points, and he hits like a truck, right? So my fighter, as an example, was like the inverse of that. He didn't have as many hit points, but he was really hard to hit, flew around the table, and he had that extra like range from his reach weapon. So he had this massive threat bubble around him. So you have the freedom to do that. But again, your model is kind of what it is once you build it. Unless you have the skill set to, say, magnetize models or in some other similar way, like pinning it, allowing you to switch the weapons, you're pretty much locked in to what equipment the model has on them. So that's what kind of differentiates a miniatures-based game like this, a Dungeon Diver style game, from an RPG or a CRPG where you have a lot more room to change things. You know, and you see this with almost any kind of Dungeon Diver style game like Hero Quest or Descent or whatever. They represent alternative equipment through cards, and the model kind of is what it is. However, in the future, we do hope to overcome that in some way. But for the time being, that was one of the limitations that we had to accept. All that said, what is a fantasy RPG style game without magical equipment? A boring one. So we decided to go with a different route for upgrading equipment to allow you to customize your gear the way you want within some sensible boundaries. I'm going to take a step back to contextualize this a bit. First of all, in Bloodthrone, all heroes have 3 pieces of basic equipment. Unlike games where you control a single character and as such you have room for intense levels of detail, Bloodthrone is a party-based game, and in general you're going to be controlling more than one hero. So we wanted to hit the sweet spot of giving you the detail that you love in an RPG without having to worry about like what pauldron hero number 8 is wearing. So we went with a streamlined system in which each hero has armor/clothing, their main hand, and their offhand. This covers the basics of what does the hero wear and what are they holding. Clothing ranges from nothing. For example, if you wanted like a Celtic berserker, a woad warrior or something like that, you can opt to go with no clothing at all. I mean, not totally naked unless you wanted to do that at home in a private game with your own model, which, hey, do whatever blows your hair back. But we wanted to balance everything, right? So if you chose to go with no clothing, again, I say that in quotations, you get an HP bonus to reflect how tough this character must be to go into battle bare-chested, right? Now, the more common option is to select some sort of a clothing option, and these give you benefits. They don't have any damage reduction, but they also they barely take up any of your encumbrance. And they have benefits such as having extra pockets, right? Like we call that class garb. If you take class garb, you get 1 extra class skill, right? So it's like you have extra equipment on you that allows you to have more skills than you would otherwise have. Another option would be stealth garb, which, as the name would imply, it increases your evasion. Evasion's like armor class a little bit. It's for something like a rogue or a ranger, although anyone can take it. Imagine it as like camouflage or, like a black ninja style outfit or whatever. And it just gives you an option that doesn't take up much of your encumbrance, that allows you to give yourself a little bit of a boost. These options are actually really common. A lot of characters opt to take stealth gear. If you're building a character that wants to have really high evasion and is quick, that works out really well. Or if you have like a wizard, for example, you give them their class garb, aka it could be a wizard robe, and they get 1 extra spell, for example, that they have a choice to use during a game. Another example, the monk in the hero expansion, he doesn't wear any armor at all. He's bare-chested. We felt like it really fit with the monk archetype. So he has even more HP. So that's just some examples of characters that go the no armor route. When it comes to armor, there are 3 kinds. We decided to streamline it. Initially, I had all this much more complex like plate mail and chain mail and leather, and they had different keywords that made them more vulnerable to certain kinds of attacks. We may circle back around to that in like an advanced version in the future, but out the gates, it was just too much. I felt like the game's already fairly complex, super fun, and we did everything we could to streamline it. But I was like, do we really need this extra level of detail? Like, cloth armor absorbs acid, so it does extra damage. And it's like, yeah, that's cool, but it just gets to be kind of a lot to keep track of. But once we get a player base and we get player feedback, if it doesn't seem like it's overwhelming, we could totally circle back around to it because it's all written. So anyway, there's light, medium, and heavy armor. And the way that works, essentially, is they have increasing amounts of damage reduction. So light armor, it's very straightforward. You remove 1 damage die from your opponent's damage pool. Medium is 2, heavy is 3. So the heavier that you go on your armor, it slows you down in terms of reducing your movement, and it also makes your initiative lower. So when you're deploying heroes and monsters, they deploy in reverse order, meaning the slowest characters deploy first, the quickest characters deploy last. They get to see where everybody else goes. But then when you activate, the quickest characters go first, the slowest characters go last. So to give this a contextual example, the monk, again, Kechueo is one of my favorite characters personally. He doesn't have any equipment. He doesn't have any armor. He's super quick. So he's going to deploy usually last and then go first, but he does so sacrificing damage reduction. Ajax is at the very other end of the scale. He has a heavy shield, heavy armor, and a sword. He is almost always going to go last. The lowest initiative is basically 1, or you can get to 0, but we don't need to go into that right now. He's 2, right? So he's almost as slow as possible. That means that he's going to deploy first. Everyone else gets to see where he's deployed. He's also slower because he's got all this heavy equipment. And then he's going to activate last. That's not always such a bad thing, though, because you get to see what everybody else does before you act. But it does mean every turn he has to wait. Everyone gets to wail on him before he gets to do anything. So that's kind of the way that we balanced out equipment and armor and things of that nature to try and make it a real choice. Like, you don't always default to taking the best, plate mail or whatever. If you want a rogue that's quick, rogue can't take plate mail as an aside, but let's ignore that for now. We wanted it to be a viable option to go light armor, light equipment, to make it to make it have real choices. For example, if you had a fighter and you're like, I'm going to go medium armor instead of heavy armor, yeah, you don't reduce as much damage as the fighter with heavy armor, but you go before him. So, if those two characters are fighting each other, that might be the difference between winning and losing, is because you get to hit him before he hits you. Now, weapons or hand equipment, for lack of a more eloquent way of putting it, come in some broad categories. It's basically, there's, light, medium, heavy, very heavy again. Now, they don't say that on them, but you get like a dagger is light, for example, and a two-handed hammer would be slow, is a better way to put it. So we categorized all of those in the design process, like the quick weapons, the normal weapons, the slow weapons, the very slow weapons. Like a very slow weapon would be like a musket, for example, like a black powder rifle, which takes time to reload, etc. Those basically have the exact same baseline stats. To give you an example, a normal speed weapon like a sword, for example, they all reduce your initiative by the same amount. They all take up the same amount of encumbrance. I'll explain encumbrance in a second. And they all basically do 4 damage dice, right? Just to kind of give you an example, the quick weapons reduce your initiative by nothing. Usually they take up less encumbrance and they do 3 damage dice, etc. You kind of get I assume you're understanding the picture I'm building here. So to distinguish all the different weapons within a certain category, for example, going back to the sword has a keyword accurate. Accurate obviously would increase your odds of hitting. A mace, which is another example of a normal speed weapon with 4 damage dice, lowers your initiative and increases your encumbrance by the same amount as a sword. What makes it different from the sword? Well, it has a keyword called armor piercing. Armor piercing allows you to bypass heavy armor more easily. So we did this again for balance and parity reasons, right? Like one of the things that always annoyed me about D&D, for example, is that some weapons were just better, right? Like whether they did 2d6 instead of a d12, or they just did more damage. Like in the old days, a katana was a d10 and a longsword was a d8. And I was like, well, why the hell would I ever take a longsword when I could take a katana? Now, of course, for role-playing reasons, you might choose to, but it was just, that always frustrated me. It's like sometimes it was just an obvious choice. So we worked very hard to have parity between the weapons. Now, of course, you may feel like one is better than the other through playtesting or your own playtesting experience, and that's fine, but we really tried hard to make them equal. And there are some exceptions to the rule I just said, like, for example, a spear or any weapon that has reach, like Inquisitor Cal's whip has reach. Because reach is so powerful, it gives you one extra square orthogonally, and I'll explain that in more depth later, but basically on the forward, backward, left, right, not diagonal, you get one extra square of range. That's so strong that to balance that keyword, we gave those weapons -1 damage. So a spear does 3 damage as opposed to a sword that does 4, but with a spear, you can engage someone from further away, for example. Now, there's more keywords than that, and weapons can have multiple keywords. We won't go through all of them right now, but that's how we differentiated the weapons and hopefully made it a real choice for you. Again, just like with all the other equipment, we wanted it to be a real choice, right? So to give a contextualized example of this, Ajax has maxed out defensive stats and power. Power is like might or strength. You usually add your power stat to the damage of most attacks. There are exceptions. So Ajax is hard to hit, hard to hurt, ton of hit points. He hits like a truck, but his perception, which is the stat that increases your ability to hit in melee, is really low. So we gave him a sword with accurate to counterbalance that. So he may not always hit, but when he does, he just splatters things. It's really fun. Conversely, you could make a fighter, for example, that had higher perception and then went for an axe or a mace or a weapon with those keywords, armor piercing or deep wounds, which respectively allow you to penetrate armor or to do more damage, but you're sacrificing that accuracy boost. Lastly, there are shields, which increase your evasion statically. So think like armor class in D&D. Basically, that's how hard you are to hit with physical attacks. And they also allow you to actively block damage. So if you take damage from your front arc, and the cool thing with the shield is it can be against ranged melee or non-raw damage magical attacks. Raw damage bypasses all defense. It's like critical hits, basically. You can do so, but then it slows down your movement because you're focused on defending yourself with your shield. And then finally, there are things called tools. Certain skill-based classes, basically they have to sacrifice one of their hands to hold their tool. And think of like the bard with their instrument or an alchemist with their alchemy set. And mechanically what this does is it eliminates some of their options. You know, they can't dual wield, may not take a shield or a two-handed ranged weapon or whatever the case may be. But they have really powerful innate abilities that balance this out. And the tool is the thing that allows them to do that. Beyond this baseline, each hero can take one accessory, which is a supplementary item they wear. Think of like a cloak or a belt or a ring or whatever, you get the picture. And they can take one consumable item, which is something that they carry and use one time, such as a healing potion. So this gives you all the options that you get in Bloodthrone. It's not as much depth as a game where you're playing one hero, and that's because you're usually going to be playing multiple heroes, and we wanted to streamline it and not make it overwhelming. So on to the loot. In Bloodthrone, we have 2 systems for loot in the game. They are purchasable upgrades and found items. So purchasable upgrades, I can't seem to say that word, work as follows. Your party of heroes works out of an allied war camp. It's the camp of the Last Accord. You're laying siege to Belphegor's Tower of Sacrifice, which is, obviously the inspiration for the name of the core box game. Your party of heroes are basically like fantasy special forces for the Alliance army trying to stop Belphegor from achieving godhood. While the normal army fights the big battle that's going on all around you, they're the ones actually going through the steps of the siege. You and your party of heroes go on extremely important missions to tip the scales in favor of the army, basically to allow the army to do what they're going to do. and allow you to take on Belphegor in the final battle when that time comes. When you first get to the camp, it's nothing more than a disorganized collection of tents. As you progress through the game, you gain resources and you're able to upgrade your camp, sort of like if you were playing a real-time strategy game like Warcraft, for example. One of the buildings you construct in your camp is the merchant tent. Once you have this, you can purchase one-time use items with excess gold you have earned. Think of things like healing potions, lock picks, magical scrolls, potions of all varieties, even some like bombs that you can throw, like alchemist fire, things of that nature. These tend to be relatively cheap. You put them in the deck of a specific hero. They stay there until you use them. Once you use them in the game, they're removed from your deck and they're put back into the merchant deck where they can be purchased again in the future. One of the other buildings that you can construct in your camp is the blacksmith. Now, in addition to other things, in regards to this conversation, the blacksmith allows you to forge one of the items for each hero. Sorry, let me say that again. You can forge one item per turn for each hero. You could forge all of the hero's items if you chose to. Each piece of gear has two options, and when you forge the item, that selection is permanent, and then the other one you cannot take. These can be things like making your equipment lighter to reduce a movement or initiative penalty, or, for example, you could forge a weapon, master crafting it, throwing on a blessing from the shrine, and it'll do more damage, for example. An important thing to note about forge upgrades is that they do stack with magical upgrades, which we'll talk about in a bit here. And one last point on the merchant stall as well is that you can sell things to the merchant if you don't think you're going to use them or if you just need some extra gold. The other route that you can go for gaining gear and upgrades is through the treasure deck, which are found. So as you go on missions, there are loot chests available in pretty much every mission that are either optional or they're a part of achieving the mission objective itself. And at the end of the mission, for every loot chest that you've successfully secured, you get to draw a card from the treasure deck. So the treasure deck is based off of your average party level. And as the name would imply, you take the average of all of the heroes in your party, and that's your average party level, or AVPL for short. So what this does is that as your average party level goes up, the potential options that you could draw in the treasure deck get better and better and better. So the average party level, we do this for a couple of reasons. For one, it encourages you to use all of the heroes, right? You don't want a couple of heroes that are lingering down at level 1 and 2 just because you don't use them very much, and that will hold your whole party back. The other thing the average party level does as well is it lets us scale the monsters up so that they continue to provide a challenge. As you level up, the monsters get better as well. Also in PvP mode, having the average party level be what dictates getting better loot also forces you to not just keep playing the same combination of characters as frequently as you can. Again, if a hero gets knocked out in a game, they're not available in the next game because they have to heal. If they go 2 games in a row, they're not available in the third because they have to rest. So this forces you to mix things up because you don't want to end up going into a PvP match with 3 level 1 characters because you were just neglecting them. So back to how the system works, the treasure cards have a number of different categories within that deck that you can draw. Some of the more mundane options are finding like valuables to sell or gemstones. So when you draw those cards, they'll tell you to add a specific amount of gold to your coffers, and then you put that card back into the deck and it can be drawn again. Likewise, you may find a card that gives you potion ingredients, which will let you take a potion keyword card from the merchant deck, and then the potion ingredient card is returned to the treasure deck and it can be drawn again. And of course, you also have the chance to find rare magical items. With the physical limitations listed above of dealing with miniatures, we decided to go with enchantments and runes for your magical equipment as opposed to specific items. This allows you to scratch that magical equipment itch, and you can build the type of weapon or armor that you want. With the combination of forging at the blacksmith and applying an enchantment to a weapon or rune to your armor, you can get very powerful equipment, and there are tons of potential combinations to keep things fresh in subsequent playthroughs. One of the reasons we did this and not say find the magical sword of striking +4 or whatever the case may be, is that as each hero has different equipment, if you did draw the sword of striking +4, it would only be able to apply to a hero that has a sword, which is exactly 1, Ajax. So that would be kind of underwhelming. It would also kind of pigeonhole you into always taking that one thing for that one character. And as every character has 3 pieces of unique equipment, which we stated, there would be a lot of cards, right? Like you'd have to do basically two, 24 for the two hands for all the 12 heroes, and then their different armor. And then if you didn't want to just have one option for everything, you'd have to have multiple. So it would quickly turn into 100 to 200 cards. It would be an unwieldy system. And there'd be times when you draw like, something you didn't even really, wasn't very exciting. So we decided to go with a more modular system to allow you to apply the magical equipment where you want it, to who you want it. And it also means that every time you find one of these, it's exciting, right? It's not like, oh, I got the dagger of singing or whatever that's only available to the bard, or whatever the case may be. As an example of some of the types of magical upgrades, you can have, say, the Rune of Intelligence, which you can put on your armor, and it gives you a boost point to your intelligence stat. Intelligence allows you to have more skills, and it increases your will defense as well, for example. Or you may find an enchantment that gives your weapon an additional keyword, right? So if you have a sword and then you find an enchantment that gives you the keyword armor piercing, now your sword acts like a mace and a sword, right? And of course, contextually, it doesn't say that. We have lore text and everything on each one of these to root it into the world, but mechanically, that's the way it would work. Some of the higher level enchantments are very powerful. It could make your weapon flaming so that when you hit a monster, it sets them on fire. So the only thing to bear in mind is that once you apply any of these cards, it's permanent. And we did this just so that it keeps organization easier, right? You put that card in their deck and it stays there. So the forging and the enchantment / runes are permanent. It permanently makes the weapon they have a magical weapon. Additionally, you can find magical accessories. These will be things like your Gauntlets of Ogre Might, for example, if you were playing D&D, or Ring of Health, Cloak of Protection, etc. Now, these can be swapped between heroes from game to game, although in practice, we find what typically happens is you find one that you like for the way you're leveling up a certain hero, and you just kind of stick with it. However, before each game, you can assign one accessory and one consumable to each hero in your party. So especially in the early game, when you only have a couple of these, you may want to just rotate it between whatever active characters you're using. So that's one of the benefits that the accessories have that the enchantments and runes do not. One of my personal favorites is the Trollhide Belt, which is a very powerful higher level magical accessory that automatically heals a hero every time they activate. You slap this on Ajax, who naturally has healing due to being a fighter. Fighter's core ability is called Untiring. They heal every turn. So if the monsters can't knock Ajax out in one turn, he just keeps regenerating. It makes him super duper durable. Another one that I love is called the Crown of Command. Now, unlike the passive buff of the Trollhide Belt just automatically works the entire time the character is wearing it. The active accessories, like the Crown of Command, they have one very powerful buff that you can use one turn, and then that's it. Now, unlike consumables, where like a healing potion where you drink it and then you take that card out of your deck, put it back in the merchant deck, these kind of accessories can be used once per game, but you keep them so that you can use them every game thereafter. So the Crown of Command allows you to use a metaphysical ability at long range, which is amazing, and allow me to explain why that is amazing. So all actions in Bloodthorn are broadly categorized as either physical or metaphysical. Physical actions are what you would think: moving, punching, jumping, etc. Metaphysical actions are magical or beyond the physical in nature. That could be, a command of some sort, etc. It doesn't have to be a spell, but casting a spell would be the quintessential example of this. In addition to this, there are 5 range categories in Bloodthorn. 2 of them are for melee, and the first one is melee, which is literally the squares around the square that your hero is in. The other one is reach, which I already explained. It's a little bit longer range than melee. Now for ranged actions, there are 3. There's short range, medium range, and long range. Now we use widgets for these. Think of like if you've ever seen Marvel Crisis Protocol or Shatterpoint, they're basically a stick with a preset range. We use these so you don't have to count squares. Like if you had a 20 range bow, for example, you don't want to count 20 squares every time you do it. So we have these sticks, these measuring widgets that make it super quick and easy. If it touches your square and the target square, they're in range. So we have short range, medium range, and then long range does not have a widget. Long range is just line of sight. So if you can see it anywhere on the board, you can affect it. So obviously, that's really good. Now to give further context to this, defensive abilities and some really strong abilities are short range. Offensive abilities are usually medium range. Very, very, very few things are long range. It's very rare. One of the only exceptions to this is heavy long-range weapons like a longbow, etc., an arquebus, things like that. They innately have long range. So as you can see, having the ability to take a spell or some sort of metaphysical skill that would normally be short or medium range, and then to be able to do them at 4 or even 5 times further away than would be normal is crazy good. To give an example of this, Brother Boldstand, who is the priest, he's the primary healer, buffer. His healing ability is short range, right? But if you have an ally that's all the way across the board with 1 HP left, Brother Boldstand uses a Crown of Command and can heal him from literally across the board. It's pretty good. Another example of one that's really fun that I used to do, the Bard, Song of the Phoenix. Bards have these really, really powerful but short range actions called shouts. Think like Skyrim, right? Like Dos Froda. They're short range and very strong. So if you have the Bard with the Crown of Command, he could, Dos Froda someone from across the entire board, which is really strong and it's also hilarious. So that gives you an example of some of the once per game accessories that are active, and also some of the passive ones that just give you a static buff. Like, for example, the Ring of Evasion, which just statically boosts your evasion stat. So hopefully that helps to give you an idea of the way equipment works in Bloodthrone. It was a very long process to basically start with RPGs and kind of roll it back from there to a game designed to be played with the human brain, not a computer, first of all, and second of all, with multiple characters. I feel like it works really well. We're really proud of the system. And encumbrance, before I forget, I mentioned it earlier, is how much equipment you can carry, right? And it's you have a baseline amount based on your class. A class like a fighter who's meant to carry really heavy equipment has a lot. A mage has very little. And then it's increased with your power and constitution. So that's the way that works. It's pretty straightforward, and it's basically just to limit wonky combos on characters that aren't meant to have certain types of equipment. But it also means that you have to build a character to take certain equipment sets. So there's more to discuss, and we'll dive into it as we go, but I think that was a pretty good intro and fairly comprehensive about the way the equipment works, the way magic items and upgrades and accessories work. And there are some signature, super powerful magical items that are designed to be used with specific characters, but I don't want to spoil the surprises. Those are quest items that you have to go on to get. I'll let your imagination run with that because I don't want to spoil it. But we do have some specific named items in there as well. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 9 of Making the Game. And again, if you want to pick up Bloodthrone and back it, you can do so over at Game Found via the Pledge Manager. We are looking like we're still on schedule, maybe a month behind. So if you do want to go in and back it, you won't have to wait terribly long to get your hands on the game. Thank you for joining me, and I'll talk to you next time.